Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So I filmed the patterning of this one as well. I'm uploading it today. I shall leave it linked below. But if you're interested in seeing how I made it up, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, I'm using this wool and cotton mix fabric in this beautiful navy colour, and then this icy blue 100% wool suiting. And then for lining, 100% viscose. I really like this lining fabric. I shall leave all linked below. And then on to the cutting out. So I'm cutting out that navy fabric first. So this is my bodice back. 2 layers of that navy fabric underneath that pattern piece, and then I have my skirt front and back. Same again here, 2 layers of that navy fabric underneath my pattern pieces, and then onto the bodice front, which I'm using that beautiful icy blue fabric. I have 1 layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece and it is on the fold, and then just to mark that dart, so I've popped a pin in at the point of the dart, and I'm just putting a little dot just where the pin pierces the fabric. So that's my bodice front ready to go. And then I have a little waist piece on the bodice at the back, and I'm using that same ice blue fabric for that. So that's all my outer fabric cut out. So now I can get on to some construction. So I've just laid 1 skirt piece over the top of the other, right sides together. This is my skirt front. And I'm just pinning that center front seam. Ready to stitch. So I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. So I just need to tidy up that edge, which I've went ahead and done on the overlocker, and press that seam open. And now I'm ready to attach my skirt to my front bodice. So I have 2 curved edges here that I need to join up. So I'm first of all pinning at the center front, and then I'm just going to put quite a few pins in right the whole way along that curve. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and being really careful here, trying to maintain that beautiful curve. Back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. And again, I've just finished off that seam and pressed it towards the skirt. And now I'm ready to pin my darts. So I'm just folding 1 dart leg over the other, right sides together, popping a pin in at the dot you seen me mark earlier, and then pinning down those legs on both sides, and ready to stitch. So I'm starting at the bottom of the legs, back stitching, trying to stick to my 1 centimeter seam allowance and making sure that my last stitch hits that dot. Just pulling my threads at the end, I'll tie those off. So I finished my edge there and pressed my dart towards the skirt. So that's my front bodice all joined to my skirt. Now on to the back. So I need to join that little waist piece to the upper bodice. So I've just lined those up right sides together and pinned, and now stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And then I finished my raw edges here, both on the center back seam and on the seam you just seen me sew. And I've pressed that seam towards the shoulder this time. So now I'm ready for my skirt back. So the same thing as I did in the front here, I'm just lining up my 2 pieces right sides together, and I'm pinning from the hem to the bottom of my zip. So starting sewing here at the bottom of my zip and stitching the whole way to the hem at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. And I went ahead and just pressed that seam open and finished those edges. And now I'm ready to attach my bodice to my skirt at the waist. So I've just laid my skirt over my bodice right sides together and pinned, and now stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and the end. So again, I finished that edge on the overlocker and pressed it towards the skirt. So that's the 3 pieces of my back all attached. So I'm ready now to join my dress front and back together at the shoulder seams. So just lining those shoulder seams up, right sides together and pinning, and ready to stitch. So stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's my shoulder seams done. Just to finish the edge and give it a nice press. So now that my front and back are joined at the shoulder seam, I'm ready to finish my neckline. So in preparation for that, I've cut out here my facing pieces. So I have 1 on the fold for the front and 2 pieces for the back. I've interfaced those pieces with just some lightweight canvas. And then for the lining, I've just cut out the same skirt pieces front and back, and then my bodice pieces I've just reshaped slightly to account for those facing pieces and cut those out. I have 1 dart on my bodice back, which I've went ahead and pinned here just in the usual way, and now stitching from the bottom of the dart leg up to the point. Pulling my thread, which I will tie off, give my dart a little bit of a press, and that's how my 2 back bodice pieces for my lining look. So now to attach that facing. So this is a little bit tricky because I want to fit these 2 shapes together and it is a little bit tough to do this, so I've kept this footage in, albeit speeded up. But this does take a little bit of time, a lot of pins and some patience. So after a little while of pinning this up, I get a rather awkward shape, but it is now ready for stitching. At my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and once I get to that curve, I'm just snipping into the curve. That will help the fabric lie a little bit flatter and enable me to sew round that curve a little bit more accurately. So that's how that looks. So I finished that edge on the overlocker and then I've clipped that curve down. And now I'm ready to understitch. So I'm stitching here quite close to the facing, about 1 millimeter or 2 away. My seam allowance underneath is pressed towards the lining and I'm stitching through the lining right through that seam allowance, using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. And I've went ahead and done exactly the same thing for my front lining and facing, so that's how that looks. So now that I've attached my facing to my lining bodices, I'm ready to complete the lining by attaching the skirt front and back. I've went ahead and done this off camera because it's exactly the same as I've shown on the outer fabric earlier. So all my seams are finished in the same way. I have those beautiful darts on the front and everything's nicely pressed. So the last thing I have to do for the lining before I can attach it to my outer is just close up the shoulder seams. So just stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, finishing off those seams. I've done the same on the centre back here, pressed that all nicely open and left myself that nice little gap for my zip to fit in. And from the front, I finished that centre front seam and given it a nice press as well. So now my lining is right side up and I'm laying my outer fabric over the top, lining everything up right sides together and pinning around that neck. Ready to stitch. So stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it nice and easy here, trying to make sure I keep that gorgeous shape of the neckline. Back stitching at the start and the end. And now off camera, I've just went ahead and finished that seam. I've clipped the whole way around the curve, just in the same way as I did for my facing pieces. Pressed it towards the lining, and here I'm understitching, just in the same way as I did on the facing pieces as well. So I'm stitching as close as I can get to the outer fabric, but on the facing, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, and this is what I get. Super neat and tidy. So now that my neckline is complete, I can move on to closing up the armholes. So currently my lining and outer fabric are wrong sides together, and in order for me to close up the armholes nice and neatly, I want to get them right sides together. So I'm using the burrito method here and just rolling one side of the bodice over itself until I get to the shoulder, and then I'm flipping out one side of that armhole underneath my little roll. I'm going to fold that over the top of the roll, line up my shoulder seam and the rest of my armhole. I'll show this again in a second when I come to sew up my second armhole. So I've pinned and I'm ready for stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, the whole way around. So to finish off that seam, I've just ran it through the overlocker and clipped the curve. And now just to turn everything right side out. So I'm popping my hand in between the lining and the outer fabric, grabbing the fabric from the hem and pulling the whole thing through the shoulder. And after a nice press, that's my armhole super neat and clean. So as I say, I'm just showing this burrito method again. So I'm just rolling up one side of the bodice, laying it on top of the other shoulder, holding on to one side of that shoulder and flipping the other side out underneath. Then lining up the shoulder piece, lining up the underarm, and ready to pin and stitch, which I've went ahead and done off camera. And now just to turn everything right side out again. So pulling all of the fabric from one side through the shoulder, giving it a nice press, and that is both of my armholes beautifully finished along with my neckline. So now I only have a few more things to do to complete this dress. So I need to sew up my side seams. So I've just laid my outer fabric right sides together and pinned, and the same thing with my lining fabric right sides together and pinned. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, the whole way from the lining side right down to the hem of the outer fabric. And as usual, I've went ahead and finished those seams. And while I was there, I've just finished the cut edge of my hem on both the outer fabric and the lining fabric. I've pressed those both by their seam allowance and pinned. And I'm going to hand stitch the outer hem and finish the hem of the lining on the machine. But before I do that, I just want to pop the zip in. So I've just lined up my zip with my outer fabric, right sides together, pinned and ready to stitch. So I'm using my standard zipper foot and I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting a couple of inches before the zipper pull at the bottom, stitching the whole way up, trying to stay at my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how one side looks. Of course I do the same on the other side, and once complete, this is how it looks. And now just to close up the whole inside by joining the lining to the outer fabric at the zip edge. So I'm just folding the lining over the top at the neckline, making sure I've got the little top tab of the zip just poking out the side, lining up both of my seam edges and stitching here at just shy of my 1 centimetre seam allowance. Back stitching at the start and the end, and I just need to clip that top corner where the little tab of the zip comes out. So I went ahead and done that off camera and pulled everything right side out, and this is how it all looks. Super neat and tidy, love this. So now the very last thing I have to do is just run the hem along the outer fabric by hand and then run the hem of the lining through the machine. So for the hand hemming, I'm using a herringbone stitch here. So I zoom in a little bit closer. So I'm just picking a tiny little bit of the fabric up from the hem. At a diagonal then, I'm taking a tiny little bit of the fabric from the skirt itself, back into the hem at a diagonal, out again into the skirt at that same diagonal, which gives this beautiful little herringbone stitch. I'm going to continue the whole way along the hem, and as I say, I'm going to finish the lining hem off on the machine. And once complete, this is how they look. Nice and neat and tidy, love that. And that is this little dress complete. So I have that gorgeous icy blue fabric on the bodice on the front, those darts and that nice curve of the waist I absolutely love, and in contrast with the navy fabric and that beautiful A-line shape of the skirt. And then for the back, I've got that lovely contrast again with that waist piece, everything nicely enclosed along the neckline and the armholes. And then from the inside, I absolutely love how this looks. So I've got my zip all enclosed, nice and neat. Got those gorgeous facing pieces which are holding everything nice and tidy underneath. I love this viscose lining fabric as well. Super comfy against the skin. Love this. And this is how it looks on. So there's a good few things I love about this dress. Number one, those darts and that curved waistline. I absolutely love it. And I think with the nice curve of the waist piece on the back, it's super flattering. I love the A-line shape of the skirt. The fabric, that icy blue fabric, is so nice. Really like that. The viscose fabric on the underneath makes this so comfortable to wear. And with a little jacket over the top, this will be the most gorgeous outfit for me. Love this.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Bye folks!